Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, the 2nd of March, 2025. The newspapers today are dominated, of course, by what happened over the weekend or on Friday in the White House. The New York Times leads with Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, pledging more European support for Ukraine. The BBC also announces, Starmer announcing a European 4-point plan to reach peace and defend Ukraine. And CNN focuses on Ukraine's allies rallying around Zelensky at the crucial summit. Zelensky, of course, profoundly undermined and perhaps embarrassed by what happened in the White House on Friday. One man who has been closely observing this is my guest today. John Lechner is the author of Death is Our Business, Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private Warfare. It's not a book exclusively about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A lot of it is. And John is joining us from Washington, D.C., where he lives. John, congratulations on the new book. It's out on Tuesday. What do you make in terms of your focus on the Wagner Group and the privatization of Russia's military institutions in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, and particularly this new friendly axis, it appears, between Trump and Putin?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, as the book tries to do, you also have to put Russia's privatization of warfare within the context of the overall global privatization of warfare that we've seen. And the book traces the history of mercenarism, especially modern mercenarism after the Cold War in the 1990s with the South African firms operating in Africa. And then under the administration of George Bush, Blackwater, and the U.S. contractors that played an extensive role in the war on terror. And Wagner, over time, became Russia's version of this. They were used as a deniable force in Ukraine in 2014 at the start of what I would call kind of the first phase of the war in Ukraine. And they came in the second phase to play a very spectacular role in seizing Bakhmut before eventually turning on the Russian state in a mutiny. But I think that role and the mutiny as well shows just the degree to which some of these kind of new types of mercenary companies have incredible resources, incredible kind of power at their disposal that can be both an advantage and a disadvantage to states.
Yeah, I think your book, John, is particularly important, focusing on Russian mercenaries. The way the war has been presented, I think broadly in Western media, is a war between a Russian army, or an invading Russian army, and a Ukrainian army. Is that wrong? Is much or has much of the responsibility for the Russian invasion of Ukraine fallen on mercenaries?
It's a great question. I mean, I think in the initial phase of the war, particularly in eastern Ukraine, in the coal-producing region of Donbass, we saw, to a certain extent, the Russian state actually be drawn in by a number of sort of patriotic volunteers, Russian volunteers, who were arriving to support local separatists. And the Kremlin turned to these mercenaries in part because they were not fully in control of the situation in eastern Ukraine at that time in 2014. And ironically, Wagner actually became a tool to assassinate wayward pro-Russian separatist leaders who would not agree to a ceasefire at this time.
And just to jump in here, John, yeah. I hope I'm not interrupting, or I am interrupting, but hopefully it's useful. The Wagner Group, of course, are they just one of the mercenary groups being used by the Russian government, or are they the only mercenary group? Has the Wagner Group become a kind of broad name to describe Russian mercenaries in Ukraine?
They were one of several types of groups along these lines in 2014 in Donbass, and that they were sponsored by a particular oligarch, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Wagner, as we see in the book, Yevgeny Prigozhin himself was a man of seemingly unlimited ambition, and after the ceasefire in Ukraine, it was really his own lobbying that really made Wagner what it was, leveraging, of course, the Russian state and its resources. But he had a lot of enemies within Putin's inner circle. And so, in preparation for the full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2021 and early 2022, the Russian Ministry of Defense actually set about trying to create its own mercenary, what we would call private military company, but not really private military company structures filled up with volunteers, sort of as their kind of counter to Wagner Group. But as we know, the full scale invasion did not go according to plan, or at least according to how Russian military planners thought it was going to go. And so the state actually did have to lean on Prigozhin and his Wagner Group again, especially in those initial phases.
We did a show a few days ago with a Ukrainian videographer, Anna Krivenko, who's working on a new movie, This House is Undamaged, about the way in which the Russian forces essentially leveled Mariupol and then rebuilt it, ignoring history and presenting it as a Russian city. The implications, I think, of her work is of the immense brutality of the Russian invasion. I mean, all wars are, of course, brutal. But in your view, I mean, it's become one of the cliches, I think, that it's associated with mercenary warfare, is that mercenaries are particularly brutal, particularly unaccountable in moral terms. Is that your reading, particularly of the Wagner Group's involvement in Russian foreign policy and Russian warfare overseas?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I myself, for the book, have interviewed probably around 40 individuals who are fighters in Wagner Group or executives working with Yevgeny Prigozhin. I think that this is a structure that most major companies, or most major countries, I'm sorry, are leaning upon. Like I said, without contractors, the war on terror, as the U.S. sought to fight it, would have been impossible without a military draft. And so, this is, whether it's right or wrong, this is kind of where we are at the moment. And certainly, PMCs and mercenaries, and that's a very loaded term, of course. No one likes to define themselves as a mercenary. Usually, they prefer contractor or something along those lines. But they certainly see themselves as fulfilling a vital role for this state. And how they are used is entirely dependent on context. Even Wagner.
But John, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, how they are used. I mean, the understanding is that these people are unaccountable and out of control. Maybe not any more than some of the people working for Blackwater, as you suggested in the Gulf Wars. I mean, there's been lots of stories, for example, about executions of Ukrainian prisoners.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much research you've done on this or whether you include this in the book, but of course it's appropriately called Death is Our Business. Are mercenaries more or less likely to simply execute Ukrainian prisoners, which is, of course, against every international rule of warfare?
Yeah, no more, no less. I think what you see through the research is that the brutality of Wagner very much depended on the governments that were hiring them. And the patterns of human rights abuses mirrored always the patterns of human rights abuses that we saw pre-existing their arrival in the conflict. And so Wagner was as brutal, or is as brutal, as the Russian military itself. They are as brutal as the Malian military and the Malian government that hires them, or the Central African Republic, or the Libyan.
Yeah, you just wrote a piece about Wagner's operations in Africa, in spite of what you call a Mali setback. Mali, of course, being a country in Central Africa.
But I think it's important to add that they tend to not be they tend not to act better than those that are hiring them, and so they will often, I would say, exacerbate or act uh, as a kind of catalyst for kind of the worst tendencies of the local hiring government or the Russian government.
What kind of people, John, worked or work within Wagner? I mean, there have been lots of stories about Russia emptying out its prisons and sending off criminals to the Ukrainian front. Is there such a thing in Russia? I know there are some in the West, and they sometimes get glamorized even in Hollywood movies, of professional soldiers who are open to be hired and well paid and very, very good at their jobs. Or a lot of the people who work within the Wagner Group, do they tend to be ex-criminals or thugs from one kind of mafia group or other in Russia?
I would say that especially kind of in the early years leading up to the full-scale invasion, the vast majority of guys who ended up in Wagner Group were guys who had served in the Russian military previously. They got out. They, for whatever reason, were bored working as mall cops or that kind of equivalent. Missed the life. Maybe had some minor run-ins with the law, some minor issues, and felt like signing up for Wagner would give them a sense of fulfillment and also not a bad paycheck. There are obviously, all sorts of individuals who come from very different uh, walks of life and different circumstances, but that was probably most of those people.
Przagin is a remarkable character. He has a face, or he had a face, which makes him look like a warlord. I don't know if he wanted to look like a warlord. He has a remarkable history. Tell me a little bit about him and why he's so important in terms of first, I think, his friendship with Putin, and then, of course, this rebellion. It might even be an attempt to seize power.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to understand about him was he always had a chip on his shoulder. He grew up kind of on the wrong side of the tracks in the Soviet Union, was a kind of a street thug and thief, went away to prison for 8 years, and so he was an ex-con. And when he got out in what was now St. Petersburg in the early 90s, he slowly worked his way up to become a restaurateur who catered to the elite. And I think his dream, his goal, and his ambition was to overcome his status within Putin's Russia. And that ambition was really kind of the drive that brought Wagner Group to all of these different places around the world, is that if he could keep delivering these victories to Putin, the higher he could rise and overcome his own internal enemies within that circle.
It sounds to me, as an outsider growing up in St. Petersburg in poverty, I mean, Prigozhin was Jewish, that he's not entirely different from Putin himself. Do they have a lot in terms of their personal histories in common?
That's a great question. I mean, I think what Putin liked in Prigozhin was sort of that uncouth behavior, sort of that kind of gangster type Prigozhin could be many people to many different, could be many persons to many people, and so he was uncouth. He was sort of that tough guy amidst a lot of, especially over time, kind of buttoned up bureaucrats who were surrounding Putin, and he framed himself as someone who would get, if you gave him a task, no matter how dirty, he would get it done. And so there was certainly, I mean, Putin himself is former KGB. Obviously, they are used to working in kind of gray zone, both moral and uh, official. And so I think that there was they did connect probably on that level.
You said he did some of Putin's dirty work. How much blood? I mean, he's no longer around now, but how much blood did he have in his hands? Did Putin get him to assassinate some of his enemies, beat them up, intimidate them? I mean, he had the security services too. Did he use Prigozhin in some ways to intimidate the official security services? Did he create rivalry between these mercenaries and the official Russian state?
Well, here's kind of the interesting question, and why I think Prigozhin was important to write about is that, in short, we don't really know when it comes to the kind of the domestic political threats. But what Prigozhin would do is go out there and kind of do these types of things, go after the political opposition, not necessarily directed by Putin, but as a form of virtue signaling within the regime. And that's also kind of how we can think about his sponsorship of mercenaries in Donbass, and the fact that they were also going out and killing wayward separatist leaders. These aren't things that are necessarily directed by Putin, and kind of the people under him take a guess at what might please Putin, and they go about and do it in the hopes that they would be rewarded as well. So it's very tough to know, kind of in this environment, if the tail is wagging the dog as well.
It's rather like Elon Musk and Donald Trump, it sounds like.
I mean, there's versions of this everywhere, right? When we think about kind of what our own kind of equivalents to this would be, I think it starts to make a lot of sense. Putin has the same 24 hours as you and me, and so he isn't able to control everything that's going on within the system. And if you're someone like Prigozhin, who frames his personal ambition as furthering Putin's regime and furthering the national interests of Russia, you have a lot of leash to go out and kind of pursue these initiatives as you see fit.
He seems, I mean, judging from his narrative, to be politically quite savvy. Why did he rebel against Putin? Was it a moment of madness, or does it make sense?
I mean, this is always the $1 million question. I think
in Putin's Russia, it's more than $1 million.
In Putin's Russia, it's more than $1 million. Yeah, exactly. I think that he, over time, he was someone who was narcissistic. He had an incredible ego to begin with. The coverage and how important he became, not just in Russia, but internationally, as his men were throwing kind of human waves at the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, promising to take this city from the Ukrainians for Putin. I think he truly began to believe a lot of what was written about him in terms of the power that he had, both especially politically. And he mentioned in a few videos that, and he always puts it as, some people are saying that this large force, Wagner, that I have, which at that point is around 50,000 people, is making me political. And when his rivals in the Ministry of Defense decided to try and take him down, and they tried to take him down by making all the people in Wagner, all the soldiers, sign a new contract with the Ministry of Defense, I think he saw that as tantamount to taking away his political power, the leverage that he has, which would, whether it was tomorrow or whether it was 5 years from now, lead to his obscurity, which for someone who had gotten used to the spotlight would have been very tough to bear, but also perhaps his ultimate demise as well. And that is probably what prompted him to turn and march on Moscow. And the march was always officially, and I spoke with people who participated, it was always officially a mission to capture the Minister of Defense and the top general and kill them. And essentially create a fait accompli whereby Putin would now have to throw his support behind Prigozhin because there's no one literally who can replace him now.
How close was this? I remember when it was reported, it seemed very dramatic, and he turned around halfway outside Moscow in a kind of Napoleonic way. Was this realistic? Could he have captured the Ministry of Defense and executed its senior people?
Oh my! I mean, we don't know.
Well, you
Honestly,
know better than I do,
I can't.
John. I
I
mean,
can't
how
tell.
realistic was
Yeah.
it? I mean,
I think.
what year was this?
I
Was
think
this 2 years ago?
this is 2023. This is yeah. They were essentially moving into empty space at that time. Obviously, the Russian state was not prepared for its forces to turn back and march on Moscow. All the major kind of units were obviously deployed on the front in Ukraine. I I think that if they finally started closing in on Moscow, we would have seen significant Russian air power be deployed on the convoy, but there still might have been significant violence within Moscow that would have been destabilizing. And so we don't know exactly how destabilizing it would have been, but it would have been catastrophic for Putin's image. It would have
You mean
been
internally? I'm not sure he has much of an
absolutely
image internationally.
internally. Yeah, of course. This would have brought back, for Russians, this was sort of a a moment of remembrance of the chaotic 1990s when you had very powerful oligarchs often fighting it out with each other in the street, obviously on a tremendously kind of on a tremendously different scale. But I think that the state would have probably won in the end.
What I don't understand is that when he turned around or called his troops off, there was an attempt by Putin, and he's certainly not the most trustworthy of fellow, to forgive and forget. So there was some forgiveness and some forgetting, although, of course, the forgetting didn't really happen. And then the next thing you know, Prigozhin is dead after the plane he's flying in comes down to the ground, a Putin-esque accident. But why didn't he just leave the country? Surely he was politically sophisticated, intelligent enough to understand that Putin is not the kind of man to forgive and forget.
I mean, I think this is where we point to the ego and the hubris that would have guided him to make the decision to march on Moscow in the first place. I think he, given kind of his overall character, I find it very difficult that he could have, after all of these events, simply gone off to retire in a log cabin in Siberia, or head off to some island in the Pacific. I mean, this was a guy who thrived on the international attention, on kind of the constant coverage. He was simply not able, I think, to step away from it all. And given that, he was working tirelessly to try and prove to the regime that he was too big to fail, that he needed to be the one in charge of the Africa operations, that he needed to be in Belarus. And ultimately, that was sort of his delusion, was the idea that he was irreplaceable because, as we saw, it was decided that he certainly could be.
Yeah,
replaced.
we're all irreplaceable, John, until we're not. Did the CIA miss a trick? Could he have been tempted to, so to speak, defect and come over to our side?
I tend to doubt it. I think that he and this is something that we can say about Wagner more generally. Why it kind of to say that they're pure mercenaries and that they would fight for any state that pays the most money is probably not the case. I mean, for the most part, most of these guys, including Prigozhin, viewed what they did as furthering Russia, and they viewed themselves unequivocally as Russian patriots, even though, of course, they made a lot of money or some money in doing so.
Tonight there are the Oscars, and one of my favorite movies of the year was Anora, and if you've seen it, about the son of a Russian oligarch, a rather thuggish character. Prigozhin has a son, Pavel, who looks a little bit like the character in Anora, but he's less feckless, perhaps more of a thug in his own way. He's described as a Russian businessman. He's only 26 years old. And did he really take over the Wagner Group? Is he running the operation?
No, I don't think so. I think, perhaps he was given a deal by the Russian state, sort of a golden cage that he was allowed to remain a bit of a figurehead and perhaps keep some money. But Wagner is now effectively under the control of the Ministry.
So is it essentially no longer a mercenary group, or is it in that gray area between the official and unofficial army?
I would say that it is no longer the aspects of Wagner that were independent, where Prigozhin was really out there developing commercial interests. I would say that those aspects have now come under the Russian state, and it is no longer independent.
You've written about Wagner's involvement in Libya. We mentioned Mali earlier. How active is the Wagner Group outside Ukraine in terms of Russian foreign policy?
Well, they're still very active, especially in the Central African Republic, and active in Mali. They're now under a different entity in Libya, Africa Corps. In the Central African Republic, I would say they've managed to keep a lot of their men, a lot of the businesses, in part because that country itself isn't that important to the Kremlin. And so where Prigozhin didn't have these other rivals and other security institutions like in the Central African Republic, he was able to expand into all sorts of businesses in different areas that he saw fit. And so when kind of the military showed up in the Central African Republic to take things over, they looked at it and couldn't understand all of these breweries, gold mining operations, a counterinsurgency, and sort of the decision was made: if it's not broke, let's not fix it. And so that's where Legacy Wagner, kind of retains its greatest presence, but very much kind of under the eye of, again, the Ministry of Defense at this
point. Is there a Conradian quality to Wagner in the Central African Republic? Heart of Darkness, of course, which got turned into Apocalypse Now, about mad Americans ruling in Vietnam. But of course, it could. Conrad wrote Heart of Darkness about European colonization of Africa. Has anything changed much in terms of Wagner's involvement in the Central African Republic?
Well, I think the most important thing that I show in the book, and I spent a lot of time in the Central African Republic, is to show that uh, Africans are also very much in charge when they're dealing with Wagner Group, and Wagner is also a tool, very much of the African elite in each of these countries to prosecute a dirty war against insurgents or jihadist groups, or to leverage their own political power domestically. But Wagner is not able to just kind of show up and do whatever they want to do. They very often, I mean, basically always, need the buy in of local power brokers, local population, in order to do so.
You're a brave man, John. I certainly wouldn't have dared to do what you did. You went to Georgetown and you spent your career going to some of the most dangerous places in the world. In fact, your first book was a book about beginners Chechen. So you've obviously spent some time in
Yeah.
Chechen, which is one of the more dangerous parts of the world. You've obviously spoken to a lot of the Wagner people. I'm sure some of your friends or family thought you were kind of crazy. Why and how did they talk to you? Did they talk to you anonymously? What did you tell them you were doing, the Wagner guys?
Yeah, I mean, I first started meeting with them in the Central African Republic, and I think
Which is in its own way, even if you're not covering Wagner, is pretty risky, isn't it?
it's considered a very dangerous place. And I approached it a little bit differently, and perhaps because I'm an independent journalist without deadlines and things along those lines, I could take a much slower approach. I traveled throughout the country and got to know the country itself, and so when I introduced myself to the Wagner commanders, I think there was, of course, initial curiosity. What is a Russian
Right.
speaker American citizen doing?
Your Russian is pretty good.
I lived in Russia for a little while, so it's fluent, and so there's a degree of curiosity, and then I was able to ask them kind of questions that were interesting to them. How were they dealing with you know, cattle herders coming through these local communities and the conflict that arises? These types of things that they weren't necessarily getting questioned by Western media. And over the years, I was able, I guess, to earn a small degree of trust, at least enough, to put together their story in these places. But it would have been very difficult to just kind of helicopter in and helicopter out. It took years of time of speaking with them to get them to divulge these things for the book. And yeah, again, for the most part, most of them are anonymous, but there are several who spoke on the record, including active commanders in the Central African Republic, and so I felt was really able to get their full story.
Sometimes when people give quotes for a book, they say, "Well, I want to read it first." I don't suppose you're letting any of your Wagner people read this first, or you didn't. And book's out in a couple of days.
The book's out in a couple of days.
Are they going to be upset
but
with you, John?
I don't think so. I think they will see themselves in it. And I don't insert myself uh, as kind of the judge and arbiter of what was right, what isn't right. What I try to do instead is to let them speak for themselves and then juxtapose it, their stories with the stories of others who are not in Wagner in these conflict zones, whether they be Africans or locals working with them, or those who are suffering from their intervention as well.
That was an interesting piece a few years ago in the New York Times about it's a science fiction piece about imagining in the middle of the 21st century an entirely privatized US Army, and the headline is "Privatizing the United States Army was a Mistake." You've noted Blackwater and mercenaries being used by the U.S. state. How extensive is it in 2025 in terms of U.S. Utilization of mercenaries? I mean, Pete Hegseth, the new defense secretary, is in the news, warning of military action if Mexico fails to meet Trump's border demands. If there is military action, might he deploy mercenaries?
Oh, it's possible, at least against the cartels. I think Wagner was a next step in the process, and so the Blackwaters of the world, even at their height in Iraq and Afghanistan, were provided kind of defensive security either for officials, Western officials, or different sites kind of in these conflict zones. What Wagner was doing was a lot more. They would do that kind of work, but then they would also go on offensive operations. They would take something from the rebel. I think, given the overall geopolitical context, the rise of great power competition, these great powers tend to mirror each other in terms of tactics over time, right? Because everyone thinks that they're on the defensive, and therefore they because the other one is doing it, it requires them eventually to imitate. And so I do see a chance that we will start to see private military companies start to take on more offensive roles, especially in the Trump administration, like going after the cartels.
Yeah, I wouldn't be at all surprised, and it certainly makes sense in terms of Trump's attitude, business attitude towards the world. A lot of headlines recently about Russia's use of North Korean troops in Ukraine. Are they, in a sense, mercenaries? I mean, it's a sort of official mercenary use.
Well, hopefully, I can answer some of these questions in my next book, which I hope to write more broadly about the use of proxy forces more generally. I think there's an argument that could be made that the North Koreans are being used as mercenaries, but I would say probably more likely they're being used as proxy forces by the Russians, given just the level of agreement between the Russian state and the North Korean state to provide them. But again, mercenaries like Wagner Group, they're just another version of kind of the overall outsourcing of warfare to proxies, whether that be the SDF Kurds in Syria that are proxies of U.S. forces, or Wagner Group in Africa.
Finally, John, you talk about the outsourcing of warfare. We did a show a couple of months ago with Raj Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff, two Silicon Valley-based former military guys, writers, entrepreneurs. Their book, Unit X, How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley Are Transforming the Future of War, was one of the finalists for the FT Book of the Year. It's an acclaimed book about this increasing intimacy between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon, which seems to be reflected also in Musk's prominence in the Trump administration. Is this the next stage of outsourcing warfare, rather than paying for thuggish characters like Yevgeny Prigozhin? The Pentagon are just simply going to be outsourcing AI from private Silicon Valley companies run by guys like Peter Thiel?
The trend is in, I think, that direction, kind of for the most basic reason that this type of outsourcing makes it easier. It lowers the political risk for, it doesn't matter politically whether it's Democrats or Republicans, to prosecute a national security strategy, a foreign policy strategy that is very hawkish and interventionist. And so under the Obama administration, obviously the use of drones for assassinations went up drastically. All of this is designed to prevent at least in the Western case, in the U.S. case, to prevent the deaths of soldiers whose casualties basically have to be reported on the news. You don't have to report contractors, and you don't have to report the loss of drones or other kind of equipment along those lines. So it really lowers the political costs.
It's important stuff, John. You're a very brave man. Death is our business. Russian mercenaries and the new era of private warfare. It's chilling, but it's stuff that we need to read about, and it's not just limited to Putin's Russia. Thank you so much, John, for appearing on the show and for your work. It's important work. It needs to be done. Congratulations on the book. It's out in a couple of days. Essential reading, I think, for anyone concerned with the morality and future of war. Thank you so much, John Lechner.
Thank you for having me.